got down to Texas in early December of 1835, he found himself at Nacogdoches, where he signed on, not for the oath of citizenship, because believe it or not, he just narrowly missed the window to sign on. So the next best thing for it was that he signed on the oath of militia for 6 months, and the completion of which he would receive 640 acres of his own choosing. Now from Nacogdoches, Crockett and others under the command of Captain William B. Harrison and his mounted riflemen, they went to Washington on the Brazos, wherein their forces divided, some heading to the Rio Grande and others to San Antonio, the Alamo. Now, when they got down there, no one was concerned about the Mexican threat, because they figured that they had put such a whipping on General Coss and his troops so bad that Santa Anna would be a fool to try and come back. They also figured that he would be a madman to try and march his army over 300 miles in the dead of winter. Well, unfortunately for them, Santa Anna was that madman, and that's exactly what happened. But the night before Santa Anna and his troops took the town of San Antonio de Bayard, on February 22nd, the men of the town were having a fandango to celebrate George Washington's birthday. And come next morning, when the town was eerily quiet, most of the men trying to sleep off all what they had drank the night before, well, a lone sentry in the bell tower of the San Fernando Cathedral, he spots something off in the distance, a flash of steel in the sun. Surely, he thinks, this can't be. And he rings the alarm bell, and Colonel Travis comes out to find out what's going on, and he sends out 2 riders and says, "Boys, if it's what we fear it is, y'all come riding back hell-bent for leather." And much to his chagrin, that's what they done, leaving nothing more than a cloud of dust. But when they got back there with the electrifying news that the enemy was at the gates, they went back across the San Antonio River to hold themselves up in the Alamo. Well, believe it or not, despite Santa Anna being that madman that I told you about, he did in fact try to negotiate with them, and Colonel Travis and Bowie tried to negotiate back and forth. But they couldn't reach an agreement, and so in an act of defiance, Colonel Travis fires off the 18-pound cannon towards the town. And in retaliation, Santa Anna hangs the blood-red flag of no quarter from the church of Bayard, in token that the war is now one of vengeance. No prisoners and no mercy. And thus begins the siege of the Alamo, a 12-day siege which wore down the defenders, not only physically but mentally. Because throughout the day they were being bombarded and had to keep their heads down. And throughout the night, while the Mexican soldiers were mostly sound asleep, they had to go out and repair the damage done to their walls, as well as try and retrieve firewood and water for the fort's dwindling supply. And it even began to affect David Crockett, who began to grumble and said that, "I would rather march out and fight in the open. I don't like to be hemmed up." Well, unfortunately, he wasn't going to get his wish, because towards the latter part of the siege, various couriers had come back, including one who was Colonel Travis's cousin, James Bonham, who informed them that Colonel Phantom was not going to be coming to their aid. But old three-legged Willie, Robert Williamson, was going to be trying to muster up 600 volunteers to go reinforce the men of the Alamo. And in the P.S. of Williamson's letter, he encouraged Colonel Travis, "For God's sake, hold out." Colonel Travis, he wasn't too sure what was going to happen. He figured if the worst comes to worst, we might as well fight and sell our lives dearly. And so, as the legend puts it, Colonel Travis called the men of the Alamo together. And he pulls out his saber, again, use your imagination. He pulls out his sword and draws a line in the sand and asks any of those who are willing to fight and possibly die for the cause of Texas independence to step over that line. Needless to say, just about everyone did, including Jim Bowie, who was sick in his cot, and he was asked to be carried over. But the one fellow they said never crossed over was a Frenchman named Moses Rose. And before you go harping on Mr. Rose for not wanting to fight because he's a Frenchman, I'll go ahead and tell you right now that ain't the case. Because Mr. Rose was a veteran of the Napoleonic campaigns over in Europe, and he had seen warfare of this type before and knew what was coming. So when he was asked why he didn't want to stay and fight, he shrugged his shoulders and said, "I'm not ready to die yet. I've come here to live profitably, not die gloriously." And off he went into the history books. But in the pre-dawn hours of March 6, 1836, Santa Anna began to put his battle plan into action, with the different divisions all surrounding the compound known as the Alamo. And at around 5:30 that morning, a Mexican soldier who had been forced to wait for hours in the cold darkness finally snapped and started shouting, "Viva Santa Anna! Viva la República! Long live Santa Anna, and long live the Republic!" And now that the element of surprise was lost, Santa Anna ordered that the deguello be blown and that the men advance. Now, despite being caught off guard, the men of the Alamo did in fact put up a pretty stiff resistance, repelling the enemy twice from their walls. But finally, along the north wall where Colonel Travis was killed, they began to make their way into the compound. Now, the men of the north wall, they started pulling back across the compound to the long barracks. But in doing so, as they were barricading themselves in, they had made a fatal mistake because they had forgot to discharge their artillery atop the ramparts. And now the Mexican soldiers turned the Texians' own cannons on them, blasted open the doors, and rushed into the long barracks. And within a matter of minutes, they had turned the place into a slaughterhouse. And with the same bloodlust, they went up into the convento, the infirmary, to shoot, stab, and bayonet those who were laying sick and wounded in their bed. And then they began to pour through the compound like ants. Finally, they made their way to the low barracks, where Jim Bowie was laying ill in bed. Now, some sources say that Jim Bowie was so sick that he was already dead by the time they got in there. Other sources say that if he was lucky, he might have at least got off 2 shots with his pistols before they were on him, and they stabbed him while he lay there in bed, hoisted him up, and paraded him around as a trophy of war. But the one defender of the Alamo whose death still causes debate even to this day is the death of David Crockett. Because we have many sources stating that he died during the fighting, and other sources stating that he was possibly captured along with several others before being brought before Santa Anna and then swiftly executed. But regardless of that, whether he died during the fighting or was executed in front of the general, right before the smoke had even begun to clear from the Battle of the Alamo, Santa Anna walks in and surveys the scene of carnage and laughs and passes it off as little more than a small affair. And militarily speaking, he was right. The Battle of the Alamo, lasting only 90 minutes, was a small affair. But it was that small affair that would light a fire in the hearts of the Texian patriots, a fire that would erupt on the plains of San Jacinto in April of 1836, when the forces under General Houston completely decimated Santa Anna's army in 18 minutes. And as the Texian and Tejano forces charged across the field, the cry on everyone's lips was, "Remember Goliad and remember the Alamo." And of course we remember the Alamo to this day. But it's also important to remember the men who fought and died on both sides of the conflict for the causes that they believed in. We certainly remember men like Captain Dickinson, Jim Bonner, Colonel Bowie, Colonel Travis, and of course we remember David Crockett. Thank you very much.